You're right. Okay. Look, thanks for coming along, everyone. I mean, it's probably not the most inspiring of talks. It's kind of talking about methodologies and processes and ways of doing things, but hopefully there will be some little nuggets of interest in there. And you know, who knows? Maybe you'll want to call me and ask for more information. So basically, what I want to talk about, as Daria and Jan were saying earlier, you know, we're starting to put more emphasis on services. This could be managed services where we help you feed and water your OpenVMS systems. This could be just professional services where you need some help upgrading your system or something like that, setting up x86 infrastructure, whatever, but also application services. So many of you will remember, you know, back in the days, moving from VAX to Alpha and from Alpha to Integrity. And, you know, some customers need virtually no help. Maybe your application is nice and simple, or you've got all the skills in-house and you can quite easily migrate your applications to x86 and test them and so forth. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got other customers who really just don't even know where to start. And that's, you know, we can fit in anywhere. If you just need a little bit of guidance or if you need a lot of help, I want to hear from you. Either me directly or go through Jan or one of the account team. So I will apologise to Kiara for not adhering to the template because I'm one of these silly people, annoying people who prepares slides like months in advance. So when you sent me the template, I thought, no, I'm not redoing my slides. But anyway, so this is the agenda. We'll just talk about application migration services, so how we can help you or your customers to migrate to x86. Obviously, that's the focus. Also want to talk a little bit about modernization in general. So this could be where, you know, you or your customers just want to get a little bit more out of your existing OpenVMS systems. I don't care if it's Alpha, Integrity, x86. Maybe you've got a third-party product that doesn't exist anymore, or there's no support for it, and you want to replace that with something else. Possibly you need to integrate your OpenVMS systems with some new whiz-bang thing that the boss has just gone and purchased and you're not sure how to do it. We can help you with these things. So application services, really, I mean, it's pretty simple. It's basically just a set of services to help you migrate your applications across to x86. And to do the other things that I just mentioned around modernizing your environments, integrating OpenVMS applications with other systems and so forth. When it comes to migrating to x86, you know, Norm, who's not in the audience today, thankfully, but, you know, Norm will tell you it's just a case of recompile, relink, and everything will run perfectly. Yeah, okay. There are some applications certainly where that's the case. You may indeed get a clean compile, or maybe you'll get a few warnings spat out or something like that. But for an application of any sort of complexity, it's never that straightforward. You know, have you even got all the code? Do you know how to build this thing? Are there third-party products that potentially need to replace? And so on and so forth. It can get complicated really, really quickly. So we've got a process that we follow, a methodology that we adhere to actually lead customers through this and help them get their applications across to x86. If you are looking at moving to x86, as Jan said, 2025, we're expecting that to be the migration season for various reasons. But the sooner you start thinking about what you've got to do to migrate to x86, the better, and talk to us about it if you've got any questions or you're unsure about things. So, as I say, the migration service follows a fairly standard methodology. There are several phases. Discovery phase, I'll talk about these phases. This is where the talk gets a little bit boring. Optional elaboration and pilot phases, migration, which is the real work, actually getting the application across to x86 and working with customers in deployment. All of this would be very familiar to Kerry, having done many of these migrations himself for various customers throughout North America. And like I've said in the yellow box down the bottom and mentioned earlier, you know, these applications, the migrations range in size from, you know, maybe 20 to 50,000 lines of code all the way up to customers that have applications written in multiple languages, 6 million lines of code or more, and a myriad of third-party products and layered products and so forth that need to be factored into the equation. But the general process we take in terms of discovery phase through to deployment is fairly consistent for all of those situations. discovery phase really is just figuring out, well, what are we looking at here? You know, how big is the problem? Scoping it out, giving customers some insight into how long it might take, and probably most importantly, you know, how much is it going to cost to actually get my applications across to x86? What are the risks? What sorts of things do we need to worry about in here? And at the end of the discovery phase, we'll have some idea of how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, and we'll have a bit of a plan. Okay, a breakdown of the work that needs to be done. As I say, we'll identify any risks, effort, so on and so forth. The main inputs, the inputs are fairly obvious. Obviously, we need to look at the application code. So we'll do some kind of review of the application code to identify potential problem areas. We'll look at the product stack that you've got in there to identify potential product areas. We'll basically look at anything you've got. You know, have you got test procedures? What's your documentation look like? Everything. Build scripts. Do you actually have some? You know, is this code in source code control? Or do you keep it in directories with dates on them or something like that, and you're really not sure what you're running in production? We need to know all of these things. The elaboration phase, which is kind of optional, and it really depends on what we find during discovery. You know, if the application being migrated is really complicated and there are some bits in there that we're not kind of sure about, we maybe need to spend a little bit more time doing a little bit more investigation and digging to revise the plan and the estimates. Right, for a small project, typically not going to be required, but for one of those big hairy ones, it probably is. And also for some of those really bigger projects where maybe there is, an example might be, maybe you're having to replace a third-party product with some piece of open source software or something like that. You're fairly confident it's going to work, but you're not 100% sure. So maybe what you would look at doing there is some sort of pilot phase where you will actually test the solution. Is this actually going to work? Is it going to work well enough? And you're not only going to test it from a functional perspective, does it produce the right answers, but from a non-functional perspective. Is it fast enough? I mean, we've got one that I'm going to talk about fairly soon. So I won't kind of spoil the fun now, but where we have had to do some of this kind of pilot phase work to just prove a technology change, if you like. But generally, you know, with any pilot project, you need to make sure that it's a suitably representative slice. There's absolutely no point in testing something that's insignificant or inconsequential. It actually needs to be sufficiently complex and detailed that it does actually prove the point, right? But not so big as you've kind of done the whole lot. Obviously, the migration phase, that's where the bulk of the work happens. Let's port this code, let's rebuild it, let's relink the application. And, you know, one thing that customers such as yourselves or partners need to keep in mind is we are experts when it comes to porting applications or working with application code, but we do not understand your business, right? So we cannot test your applications, okay? We don't know, Gary, how your business works, and I'm not sure we really want to, but we can help you to migrate the code, right? Although in your case, I think you're probably fairly capable of doing that yourself, but you understand the point. So if we're doing the work, we'll port the code, we'll recompile it, we'll relink it, it'll be pristine. There won't be a single compiler warning if I have my way, there won't be a linker warning, anything like that. Over to you to actually test it, give us feedback if there's rework required, no problem. It's all part of the effort. Just because something compiles and links does not mean it's going to run or produce the right results. Right? Lest we forget the difference between a VAX float and an IEEE float. And I once accidentally paid all the schools in New Zealand, just about paid all the schools in New Zealand something like $10 billion because I hadn't done floating point conversion somewhere when we ported from Alpha to Integrity. But that's a separate story. I also took down a government department mail server, but that's another story. So deployment phase, obviously, we will work with you during deployment to help you get the application installed, up and running, and you'll go through your test process, acceptance testing, you'll identify problems, we'll do rework, and you know, once it's all done, we'll have a big party and celebrate a successful project. Obviously, the deliverables there, an application that you can install and test, and hopefully everything goes well. So that's the general process we take. I mean, that's not exactly rocket science or anything like that. It's a fairly standard formula that's tried and true. The key things, I think, are that initial discovery phase and possibly elaboration, where we can actually quantify just how big this thing is. You know, how much is it going to cost? What are the risks? How much time is it going to take? And so forth. If we do a good job there, if our analysis has been good, then generally speaking, the rest will flow fairly smoothly. We know what we're doing. You know, planning, planning, planning. Right? These are just some of the fundamental things, and this is kind of obvious, the sort of stuff that we'll need to know if we're going to undertake a migration project for you. It's useful to know what the application does. Like I say, we don't want to be experts in how your in the business logic of your applications, but it's useful in general terms to understand what it does. We want to know how critical it is. You know, how important is this thing to you? We want to know what it's currently running on, what technologies you're using, things like middleware, what databases, unsupported third-party products. Do you have all the code? How is that code managed? Do you have build procedures? I mean, the number of times I've, even been on site to strange and exotic locations, and the customer has sworn to me that they have all the code and that they have a build procedure that you just press the button and it builds the entire application and everything's wonderful. And I've got a week to port this thing from alpha to integrity, and I get there and it's just a bomb site, right? We need to know if it's a bomb site or not. So do you have all the bits and pieces? Do you have test procedures? Do you know how to test this? Because this could be more work for you. You know, maybe you need to get your team on board to actually start figuring out what the test plans look like and so forth. Again, none of it's rocket science, but you would be amazed how many environments, how many customers I've gone into where a lot of these things, it's just, yeah, chaos. So I'll just talk briefly now about, I won't name the customer, but it's a customer in Scandinavia that's in the process of moving from integrity to x86. And it's an interesting application. It's not massive. It's like about 400,000 lines or 300,000 lines of code in total. Mixed language environment, C, C++, Fortran, I would say probably in equal measure. I think probably over time the customer has been swinging towards C++, but for the moment, let's assume maybe 100,000 lines of each. And they have a Sybase database that's running on Windows. And when they moved from alpha to integrity, they just binary translated the Sybase client libraries, excuse me, for integrity. And that had worked well for some number of years, but we can't take those libraries across to x86. It's just not going to happen. So in this particular project, we did an analysis of the code, we did an analysis of the third-party products and so forth, and Sybase is a problem. How do we deal with that? So because I've done previous projects like this, I had a high degree of confidence that we could replace the Sybase client with a little piece of open source software called FreeTDS, for which we'd actually developed an embedded SQL preprocessor some time ago. And it took some enhancement of that tool and that API, but essentially we have successfully for that customer replaced the Sybase client with the open source FreeTDS component. And this is a very, very sensible customer. And one of the things that they did, and I didn't even have to say it to them first, is within their integrity environment, they took out the Sybase client and put in FreeTDS, right? Because if you're, say, doing a migration from integrity to x86 and you're changing some piece of the technology en route, that's far higher risk, because when it doesn't work on x86, is the problem a consequence of the port, or is it a consequence of the fact that I've introduced this new thing? So this customer very, very sensibly, and as I say, without any prompting from me, embarked upon an initial project where they swapped out this Sybase client and put in FreeTDS, and that's gone incredibly well. There's one very, very little minor glitch that basically it just doesn't log the right message when it gets a deadlock scenario, but the application behavior is the same. So literally that's been very, very successful. The customer is now at the point where I did, well, my team did an initial job of building the code on x86, eliminating compiler warnings, which you always get, of course, when you update to new compilers. That the C and C+ compilers in particular tend to spit out a few things that you need to deal with. But we basically got the code into good shape and handed it back to the customer for them to start putting into their x86 environment. My colleague, Robert Nidal, who I'm sure some of you know, Robert did a great job of setting up the customer's x86 environment, which is VMware on Windows. And for those of you who do know Robert, I mean, it's just pristine. You know, when Robert does a piece of work, it's a work of art, essentially. So really nice x86 environment. Things going pretty well as far as the porting is concerned. The customer's now going through the process of rebuilding the applications themselves on x86. And I mean, this is a production manufacturing, oh, yeah, I'll call it manufacturing environment. So they have to be very careful about their test strategy, right? You know, if this thing messes up, they've got a very big mess on their hands. So they're thinking very carefully about their test strategy here. But generally speaking, interesting project, gone very well, and some good learning experiences for us. The way in which we approached it, if you think back to the methodology that I described before, you know, we had the discovery phase, elaboration, et cetera, et cetera. But in general terms, the overall scope of the project is listed there. We did that initial investigation. We've helped them with the implementation. As I said, Robert has done a great job of setting up the x86 environment. There'll probably be a little bit of tuning at the end of this just to make sure that things are running well. And in general terms, it's looking good. I think at the moment, depending on how testing goes, we'll probably look at going into production Q1 or something like that next year with this particular application. Just a little bit more on the scope there. I mean, again, all of this aligns with the methodology that I described before. Initial review, reported the code, testing is a joint effort. Obviously, in this case, I mean, this thing connects to PLCs and various devices, so there's only so much testing that can be done that's not in situ, if you like. Basically, all we can do is prove that things build and they look like they run, but as I said before, we don't understand the customer's business. It's up to them to do the bulk of the testing. And obviously the deliverables at the end of this project, so Q1 next year, will be a lovely, pristine working application on x86. And we're looking pretty good to do that. I think probably the main technical thing that's outstanding is there might be a little bit more work for John Regan and the compiler team on C++. But in general terms, I think Q1 is definitely, we'll get this across the line. Okay, so next up, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about modernization in general. I mean, obviously moving from Integrity to x86 is modernization, but modernization can mean many other things. And, you know, some of these applications that are running on VMS have been there for 30, 40 years. I mean, they underpin the business, right? They're critical to your business's existence. My first bullet point, preservation of valued business assets. But the boss has gone out and bought something new and you need to integrate with it perhaps. The boss needs to increase revenue. How can we do that? How can we reduce time to market for new services and things like this? Basically anything you can do to modernize those OpenVMS application environments. And this is an interesting statistic, right? Talk about COBOL. Every day, $3 trillion worth of transactions are handled by systems written in COBOL. Statement of fact, right? That stuff ain't going anywhere fast. End of story. And in fact, you know, there are probably more lines of COBOL being written every day than there are of most other languages. Common scenarios when it comes to modernization, we've talked about platform migrations, getting across to x86. Some customers will want to do things like, you know, we want some nice new pretty user interface or something like that. We don't want deck forms anymore. How can we plug in a graphical user interface? We've done many projects like, well, I've done many projects like that over the years. Maybe not so common. It can be problematical. The most common thing I would say, or the most common things, would really be integration. How do I get my OpenVMS application to integrate with something else within the business? And also around replacing unsupported products. You know, we're running product X. It's no longer supported by the provider on VMS, for example. What can we use instead? So I gave the example of FreeTDS with Sybase before. There are a myriad of other such situations, and we can quite happily work with you to come up with solutions for these sorts of things. A few other bits and pieces I mentioned there. You know, we've got a number of customers that are actively moving to doing external authentication, single sign-on through Acme LDAP and so forth. Database migrations, maybe not so common, but we certainly have had a few customers wanting to move to, say, an open source database or something like that. Again, quite possible, per the example I gave before with FreeTDS and the database running on Windows. Absolutely no problem from a technical perspective. So, all of these scenarios and more. When it comes to modernization, of course, there are technical challenges, right? How do we actually technically do this? How do we replace product X with product Y, for example? How do we integrate OpenVMS with SAP or whatever? You've got technical challenges like this. You've also got non-technical challenges, like, you have no one that knows anything about your application anymore. Your documentation's not great. You have poor test coverage. How do you deal with these situations? We can help you with all of these things. And in terms of how we can help, I mean, there's a myriad of services under the umbrella where we can plug in and help you here. I mean, it could be just as simple as sitting down with you for a few days, having a discussion about your environment, just exploring options, some sort of workshop. It may be a little bit more detailed where we actually start getting in there and having a poke around, looking at your applications, looking at your requirements and so forth. One thing that comes to mind, though, when I'm talking about all of this is that when it comes to modernization, you're obviously not just looking at the VMS system. You're looking at the entire enterprise. What else have you got in there? What is going on? What grand vision does your CTO have for the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years? Okay. These sorts of things need to be taken into consideration, right? If your CTO's decided that everything's moving to cloud, it's going to happen. How does that impact OpenVMS? What needs to be done? You can't just look at the VMS systems in isolation when you're doing all of these sorts of things. Introducing new technologies. So a typical example there might be, replacing a proprietary middleware component with some open source or something like that, to address integration problems and so forth. Platform migrations, we've obviously talked about that. But, you could have grand ambitions, and I hope you don't. You may have grand ambitions to move off of OpenVMS. And obviously myself or Jan and the account team are going to say, well, we'd kind of rather you didn't. But in some cases, there may be valid reasons why you need to do that. Now, we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot and say, well, we don't want to talk to you. We want to make sure that your business is successful. So if you do make that decision, we will be very sad, but we will be there to help you along the way, right? I mean, don't forget that obviously we know about VMS, but we also know about other stuff as well. So, if you're trying to take an OpenVMS application and port that thing to Linux, we understand all the subtle nuances about the VMS side, and we've also got a pretty decent understanding about the other end as well. So, we're potentially good people to talk to for that sort of thing. Modernization in general, I mean, this is, I don't know how meaningful the slide is, but I think it sort of spells it out. In general terms, the strategy. Okay, so what sort of approach are we going to take here? Let's define the modernization strategy for your business. Let's make sure we've actually got the capabilities to execute on that strategy. Then a good idea quite often with any major modernization initiative is to just try and get a few quick wins under your belt. What are a few things we can do that add value to the business that are potentially relatively low risk that we can do quite quickly? Score some points, if you like. That gets buy-in from the business, it gets buy-in from the C-level executives and so forth. And then you can get on a roll with your more strategic overall program of modernization. Apparently, I said this to somebody, you can read it, I'm not going to read it all out, but apparently I said this to somebody, I don't know, it was a quote that ended up somewhere or other back in 2018. But just to reiterate the point I said earlier, where we've had customers who have tried to move off of OpenVMS and they failed very, very badly. You can't make the assumption, that an application written on VMS with ASTs and using RMS files and so forth, that you can go and port this across to Linux and say, well, okay, we'll just go and stick those RMS files in a relational database, and ASTs, we'll just do something with threads or something like that. You can't make those assumptions that it's all going to work. And there have been numerous instances of customers spending literally decades trying to get off of OpenVMS and still not having succeeded. Because the people that are doing the job don't necessarily understand the way things work on OpenVMS, and therefore they cannot architect the solution correctly on the other side. But we would much rather you stayed with OpenVMS, because VMS is, you know, I posted a blog. Well, I didn't post the blog, Kiara posted the blog, but I talked about replacing Deck Message Queue with an open source message queuing product. But one of the comments I made in that blog post is how a lot of people, customers, kind of seem to see OpenVMS as some sort of island of business logic and data that nothing can escape from and that nobody can get into, which is completely wrong. We can integrate your OpenVMS systems with just about anything. You know, let's just have the conversation. So in terms of other services, we've talked about most of these, I guess. But one that I would bring to your attention, and this is something I worked for many, many years with a group in HP that did just this, and we made, very successful business and helped our customers greatly. There was talk at the initial session with Jan and Daria about, folks retiring in 2 days. But the fact of the matter is that people are retiring and so forth, and knowledge of these applications and how they work and things like that are leaving your organizations. The group I used to work for many years within HP actually provided application maintenance and support services, where we took over your applications and we looked after them for you. Some applications are very stable, and essentially all you're doing there is buying an insurance policy, to be blunt. But in other cases, these applications do undergo significant change at certain periods of time. We have a team that can provide this sort of service to actually provide support and maintenance of your application code ongoing. So a quick summary there. I've probably been talking way too fast, I suppose, but as I say, obviously we like to think we have a fairly deep understanding of the OpenVMS environment. We've got some really, really good people, some good skills. And like I said, we also understand other things. We do understand Linux, we do understand Windows, we do understand cloud. And we are, I think, because of this, uniquely placed to add business value when it comes to preserving the life of your OpenVMS applications, extending them, helping them to talk to other systems within your business and so forth. We can cover all of those bases. One thing that you do have to appreciate about services is, you can't kind of contact Jan or myself and say, where's the glossy brochure, how are you going to do this? We can provide you something that's probably a little bit very glossy and vacuous, but the bottom line is that all of these services engagements need to be tailored to meet your specific requirements, okay? Every engagement is going to be different. For sure, there are some common themes, but every engagement is really going to be different. So if you look at it from the sorts of technology challenges that you have that drive your business concerns, uncertain future of VMS, well, I'd like to think that VSI has solved that. Our mere existence kind of solves that. Lack of technology expertise, well, we have, as Daria and Jan said, we've got a global network of experts, and we're growing that team, and the median age of that team is getting younger. Very old application software, I'm skipping 3, it doesn't really matter, but very old application software. We can work with you to get the most out of those applications, to help you modernize them, to help you look after them. Customers tend to look at this kind of dilemma, what do we do with our OpenVMS environments? They tend to look at it in a very binary manner. They'll either, put their heads in the sand and defer doing anything, or they'll embark upon some multi-million-dollar strategy to replace the OpenVMS environment. Don't do either of those. Come and have a conversation with us, because there's likely to be another way. We can provide you with, as I say, services to help you preserve, enhance, maintain, support, whatever you like, those OpenVMS environments. Okay, and a lot of this is tied in with work that Daria talked about, that we're doing in engineering and so forth, and obviously the work that I'm doing around setting up, in my case, application services, but in terms of services in general. And this is a slide I actually stole from my old friend Chris Brown with the little jigsaw puzzle. You've got all of this stuff going on, and VSI is the central piece to this jigsaw. So that's pretty much it. But just one thing that I'll say, which I probably should have said at the start, is that, like I say, with application services, we're all about applications. I'm setting up a team working with me down in New Zealand. That's growing reasonably quickly. We do actually have VMS people down there in New Zealand, and we can train other people to do this stuff as well. That's not a problem. And of course, we have the global team elsewhere that can bring expertise to bear as and when needed. So, as I say, any application issues, feel free to contact me, or preferably go through the account team because they're far more organized than I am. Okay, so any questions? Yep.
I have one. If you're moving from titanium to x86 VMS to VMS, you know, there's a whole recalculation issue going from architecture to architecture. I'm kind of hearing from some people that there might be some floating point issues.
No. So on titanium, and I've got to be careful because Doug's sitting in the back and can probably answer the question much better than I can. But in general terms, floating point format's the same on Integrity and on x86. Now, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but you may notice some slight variances at the umpteenth decimal place or something like that. You know, the rounding may not be exactly the same, but in general terms, no. Yeah. One thing that I would comment on there, and I was actually talking with Doug about it earlier, is at the moment we don't support long doubles, or not properly. But having said that, the use of long doubles is reasonably rare. I can immediately think of 2 instances where they are used. But there are ways and means of actually dealing with that as well. So no, don't worry about floating point. It's not like going from alpha to Integrity or anything like that. No.
And for you to draw long doubles to the support.
Yeah, it's on John's to-do list, like, you know, somewhere on there. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, look, if you've got any specific problems, then you can call to me in the hallway or in the bar or anything like that. Happy to have a chat. Okay, thank you.